All right, I'm gonna wait maybe another minute before getting started, but let me know if you can see my slides. And if you have any questions about any of my homework feedback, um, do let me know. Since it's just you for now, we have some extra time, I suppose. Okay, cool. It is almost 9:02 where I am. So I'm going to get started. Looks like it's just you, Gianna, for today, but hopefully other people join. Um, my guess is that they aren't aware of this class because um, it's not, they didn't update this class date in time. And since I missed the first Sunday, this is sort of like a makeup class, but hopefully people join. But if not, again, welcome to class. Thank you for coming. And this is session 6, or the last class of Creative Writing Fundamentals. And welcome, Rafi. So today is going to be pretty similar to our other classes. I have a little writing exercise for you guys to get warmed up, and then we're going to do a review. So I'm going to take a look at all the different concepts that we learned in this class. We'll take a look at common mistakes to avoid, which look a lot like the red flags we've been talking about. And then we'll analyze the reading. So I think it was Sardines by Andy Shung. We'll take a look at that, analyze the different red flags and green lights in that piece. And then I have another feedback form for you guys to give feedback on how you thought the course was, what things you enjoyed, what things you didn't enjoy. So let's get into it. So my writing exercise for today is to write 5 observations of the natural world. Oops. So I want you to tell me what you saw this morning or today sometime, or doesn't matter when, in 2 lines. So not just a simple observation, but make it a little more complex. So the example this person gave was a water glass sat on a brown tablecloth and the light came through it in 3 places. There's no need to start your observations with I saw or I felt. You can if you want. But just try to describe something as it is. And so the twist in this activity is I don't want you to use similes or metaphors. Can you make your sentences interesting while avoiding red flags? And I think the challenge here will be to like describe things without comparing them to other things. So just describing them for what they are. Does that make sense? If it does, I will give you guys 5 to 10 minutes to do this. Feel free to send your sentences in the chat. And if you need help, let me know. great. It seems like we have a couple, so I'm just going to put them up here. Feel free to continue working. Hi, Jack. Welcome to class. Um, the exercise that we're currently doing is on the screen, and we are writing 5 observations of the natural world, something that you saw today, yesterday, anytime. But the key is that I don't want you to use similes or metaphors. So I want you to see if you can come up with interesting observations while avoiding red flags and trying not to compare things to other things. All right, take a minute to wrap up and send me the sentences that you have. It's okay if you don't have all 5 yet. Okay, while I wait, I'm going to read the sentence that I have so far. So the alarm rang through the room as the sound of birds chirping on my windowsill awoke me from my slumber. This is a great sentence. The only thing I would change is I think the sound of is unnecessary, especially because there's on my windowsill. And it seems to me like on my windowsill is modifying sound. So I think you could just say as birds chirping on my windowsill awoke me from my slumber. Any other sentences? Okay, it looks like nobody else has any. So I will move on. But if you do finish them, feel free to send them in the chat. So I think what we're going to do now is go around and I want to hear what the biggest takeaway you've learned on this bootcamp is. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I want to hear something that you would like to learn more about. So feel free to take a minute to think about that and send it to me in the chat. Okay, so somebody says the biggest takeaway to reduce unneeded adjectives and adverbs. That's a good one. What else? Rafe, Gianna, do you guys have any takeaways, something that you'd like to learn more about? Okay, so got another one. So using less red flags, I would say fewer red flags, and incorporating green lights in writing. What about this? Those are some good takeaways. What about some stuff that you would like to learn more about that maybe we didn't cover enough in this course, or didn't cover at all? Things that you're wondering about for writing, or you feel like you could would like to learn more about that might help you. Maybe it's something you struggle with when you're doing your homework. Okay, somebody would like to learn more about finding synonyms to describe a word. Good, that's a good list. I think for the finding synonyms to describe a word, that's a good point. I realize a lot of you guys struggle with redundancy or repetition in homeworks. I think what might help is maybe like trying to think about items less as their like just one thing and maybe like the sum of their constituent parts, right? So maybe like you can describe, if you keep saying like he or this character or the character's name instead of that, maybe you can describe their what's going on around them, what's going on to certain parts of them, right? So their body parts, like his leg twitched. You can also add clauses before the sentence, right? And dependent clauses, participles, and other prepositions. So you don't have to start every single sentence with the same word. Hopefully that helps with not repeating the same word too many times. And also, I think one that if you're using the same word so many times, like maybe beautiful or magnificent, maybe that's a sign that you need to look, and maybe you are just trying to say the same thing over and over, and like you don't need to be saying that, right? You just say it once and it's okay. Cool. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to do a very quick recap before we move on to some review of the reading. So the first thing we learned about was picture paragraphs, right? So we did some showing versus telling. I taught you guys that showing is about sensory details and telling is about things that go on in a character's mind, so their thoughts and feelings. I told you guys that it's not a black and white issue. There's a gray area where things can be sort of showing, but a mix. And so most things will fall sort of on the spectrum between showing and telling. They're not binary, so they're not opposites either. So showing isn't the opposite of telling. One isn't necessarily better than the other, but we have been pushing you to use showing on your homeworks. And I think you guys have been improving that. And I hope you can see that when you show in your writing, it is much easier for the reader to put themselves in the scene. And every time you tell, it sort of forces them to think. It's hard for them to get to imagine the scene and being there. And that's why we encourage you to show when possible. A lot of you guys have said red flags are the biggest takeaway. I think they are very important tools to sort of get rid of, right? So we talked about cliches. I've been sort of pointing out cliches in your homework when I see them. I think what maybe it's the same for you guys, but for me, I think you don't really realize how many things are cliches until somebody looks at your writing and they're like, that's a cliche. Pretty much if anybody can like finish a phrase, or if it's a phrase that's commonly seen in print, it's probably a cliche. Grammar mistakes. There are quite a few of these, like subject-verb agreement, dangling modifiers, pronouns without antecedents are the ones I see most often, as well as run-on sentences and random tense switches from past to present and comma splices. These typically happen when you'll try to make your sentences more complex and you just tack on clauses, and then you end up with run-on sentences, or sometimes you switch between past and present. So I've been marking these in your homework as well. Hopefully you guys are starting to see the sort of patterns that you guys are writing in your homework. The next one is repetition and redundancy. So somebody already mentioned this, but try not to use the same words over and over. One thing that I like to talk about is this concept of like word territory. So like once you use a word, especially a keyword, one that's not used all the time, like a pronoun or a linking verb, try not to use that word again and try to give it its space. So it has, its own space to have its effect. I feel like if you use words too many times together, they sort of lose their effect, right? So you want to give words their space. We talked about adverbs and the difference between good adverbs and bad adverbs. In general, adverbs that end in ly that describe a manner of doing something, we want to avoid, especially when they don't modify the meaning of the verb that comes with them. So for example, smiled sadly would be a good adverb, and smiled happily would be a bad one because that's a redundant meaning. Then we talked about is, are, was, were, has, had. These usually signal that you are using a tense that is more complex than simple past or simple present, which is what you should always be trying to write in. Also, it sometimes signifies that you are using passive voice. And I have been trying to get you guys to use active voice because it is simpler, and also it sort of moves action along, right? Passive voice is boring to read. Then we looked at verbs of perception. So he looks, he feels, he sees, he smells. We don't like these because they sort of insert the character in between us and what's happening. And you can always cut that out and just make things more immediate. The same goes for crutch verbs, which are just words that extend a sentence without conjuring a concrete image. And then we have unnecessary adjectives, which are just like the adverbs where they describe a noun, but the noun is usually already going to have that attribute. So hard rock, most rocks are hard. So it doesn't really tell us anything about the rock, and same with hot fire and dark smog. Any questions about these or anything we've done? No? Okay. Then we moved on to green lights, right? So sensory details, you guys are getting really good at these. So appealing to not just visual, your sense of sight, but also what you're hearing, what you feel, what you smell, and combining them together. We also talked about genius verbs, especially when it came to the list, refine, group method, but picking out verbs that you don't always see with certain nouns. And I think this is sort of a trial and error thing. Some of you guys are trying these and they don't really come off right, but it's good that you guys are experimenting because you'll hit upon the right ones eventually. We also have motifs, right? So repeated images that appear in, or symbols that appear in your writing that sort of tie different sections together and add meaning to these particular items. We have flow patterns and poetic devices. So flow patterns are repeated sentence structure or a poetic device. We saw these in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and we have been seeing them in the different readings that we've been doing. And obviously, we also have poetic devices, which there are a whole bunch, but some common ones are similes, metaphors, personification, foreshadowing, alliteration. And then finally, we talked about diverse sentence structures, right? So varying them in length, making sure you have some short sentences, long sentences, so the reader isn't bored, and to sort of change the pace of your writing. And you can also change the structure of the sentences. So you can put, subject verb in the front, subject verb in the back. You can all invert the verb in the subject, all these different things to keep the reader entertained. We talked about flow patterns and motifs, like I said. These can be used to emphasize a point and be broken to provide contrast. And like I said, with motifs, you can use them to tie stories together, because every time you mention a motif, you sort of tie it with the other times it's showed up, right? Then we talked about the list, refine, group method. This is a great way to sort of vary the subjects of your sentence. So you list as many nouns as possible, pair these nouns with genius verbs, and I taught you guys to sort of move up and down the ladder of abstraction, right? So I don't know, if we're thinking about a house, we can think about house at certain level, but then we can sort of zoom in, right? And so instead of house, we can have maybe porch, lawn, and then get even more specific. Instead of lawn, we can have lawn clippings or grass or topsoil. Instead of porch, we can have, you know, the curb, the rocking chair, all these different things. And so if you ever get stuck or you feel like you're using the same subject too many times, list as many nouns as you can, think at different distances, right? So different levels of size, different magnitude, specificity, and then pair these nouns with good verbs. Then refine them. So pick the ones that you want to use in your paragraph, remove the red flags once you complete the sentences, and add green lights if you feel like you're missing things, and then group these sentences together to form a cohesive paragraph. So one of the ways you can form a cohesive paragraph or organize your observations is by using the lens technique, right? So pretend like you're holding a camera and then moving it around and sort of like describing what you see. And so you can either pan left to right, you can pan up to down, and then you can zoom from far away to close, or you can start really small on something and then like zoom out, right? And you can also combine the two directions. You can also apply this with not just visual details, but also sonic or tactile sensory details, right? So you can describe what something sounds like from far away, or what it sounds or feels like really close up, and then talk about, you know, take a step back and then describe how it sounds. And this way, you give the reader a sort of logical sense for what you're doing, because if you're, you know, going from left to right, then the reader's like, okay, we're on the left now, and then they know what to expect, and then they know how to put these things together in their head. Any questions about this? Okay. Then we talked about the emotional roller coaster, right? Which is a way to plot out emotional intensity in stories. So we have three common ones here, which are Supernova, Zigzag, and Twin Peaks. Pretty much they just differ in the placement and the number of their emotional, let's say, climaxes. Supernova has one, Zigzag has one and then takes off, and then Twin Peaks has two. And all of these sort of illustrate the truth that readers like to have something going on. So you should always be sort of building to something or coming down from something. And having that sort of building suspense or falling action makes sure that readers don't get bored without tiring them out too much with too high intensity all the time. And that brings us to some common mistakes to avoid. So these look sort of like the red flags, or I guess the inverses of the green lights, right? So we have weak verbs, either using passive voice or the verbs of perception. We have not having transitions. Sometimes you guys will write things and suddenly we'll be in a different place and time and it won't be clear how we got there. Make sure you're sort of guiding the reader along and holding their hand at all times. We have repetition, poor grammar, basic vocab, and minimal to no originality. So these are things that you should try to avoid and that I shouldn't see in any of your writings. So today, the last thing we're going to talk about is the method to writing a great story. So obviously, everybody has slightly different method for writing. I'm sure you guys have your own way of doing the homework, but in general, writing a great story takes 4 stages, right? So the first one is you have to structure. So you have to think about what story you want at all, right? The inspiration has to come to you. You're thinking about the format of the story. So is it going to be a short story? Is it going to be creative fiction? Is it going to be nonfiction? Is it going to be sci-fi? And you get that all structured out, then you start to plan. So you think about the characters, right? Their different motivations. What's the story going to be? What's the main conflict? What's going to happen before? What's the rising action? What's the resolution? All these different things. You're going to plan it out. Then you write. right? So you do rough drafts, and then I think the bulk of your time is going to be spent revising. So you'll take your rough draft, you'll delete parts of it, you'll rewrite, move things around until it makes sense, and continue to rewrite. With that, I want to talk a little bit more about the story genres that we discussed at the beginning of this course. These are 3 genres that are available to you in the Scholastic Writing Competition, right? So we have personal narratives, which are the nonfiction side. And these are typically written in first person. And on the fiction side, we have short stories and flash fiction. So I don't know if you guys remember, but they're sort of the same thing, except that short stories are much longer than flash fiction. So flash fiction is typically less than 1,000 words, which is less than a page single spaced. And you have a lot less time to flesh out the story. And short stories, by virtue of being much longer, their plots get more complex, much deeper, and you can explore more. So I'm going to skip this slide and we are going to Sardines by Andy Shem. And so what I want you guys to do is to point out the genius verbs, the transitions, and use of variation within the story and how they impact the reading experience. So as usual, I have put the text as well as the question in the class document. I'll send the link here. Take about, say, 10 minutes to go through, comment the different genius verbs, transitions, and variations that you see. And then I will take a couple minutes to review what you guys have pointed out. I am only seeing one person on the document, so if anybody is having issues getting on there, please let me know. All right, let's see. So you guys have had 15 minutes about to look at this. So let me take a look at the comments you guys have made. We got a genius verb right at the beginning. A sardine sagged from his fist. Gianna says, I think this is a genius verb, but I'm not sure. I would agree. I think it is. Um, yes, I believe it also adds detail and description. I also think it like genius verbs sort of like force you to stop and think about what the actual verb is, right? And they sort of are the opposite of a cliche, which is like cliches, you see so much that they've like lost all their meaning. But when you intentionally pick a verb that you wouldn't see with this subject, it sort of like forces the reader to slow down. They're like, okay, well, I've not seen this before. And you think about what it looks like. And to me, it feels like when I just see a sardine sagged, I just think about, you know, how something sagging is like limp, right? And so I think the sardine is, you know, he's holding it, it's hanging off the side, it's clearly dead. And I think this is a great example of a genius verb. So good job. The radio hissed back, no words came out. A short and punchy line adds suspense and action into the story. Agreed. I also think it sort of like plays with the pacing, right? So when you have a short sentence that's its own paragraph, it sort of like accentuates that there is silence because before, at the end of each paragraph in your head, there's like a bit of silence, right? Because there's a little pause. And so like pairing that pause with a short sentence like this, which parallels a pause in the story, is really brilliant. What else? Rafi says this paragraph paints a detailed picture in the mind. Metal rammed into James's skull. It carved into his eye socket, slid deeper. Kane pulled the tool out, a steady trickle of brain matter coating James's suspended eyeball. I agree. I think this is a great example of showing, not telling. I think the classic example of telling would just be Kane murdered James, or Kane, you know, stuck something in James's skull or something like that, or he stabbed James. But here the author manages to convey what has happened without saying the typical things. It sort of like describes it, but in a very impersonal way. It talks about like the physical act of it happening without the people involved. And I think that sort of makes it feel even colder, like a very cold-blooded, dispassionate murder. What else? Okay, I just want to add one thing, which is I think that one of the flow patterns I saw was like this sentence. So like I thrust, splash, and then later there's a twist, crack. And I think there's one more, a tear, pop. I don't know if you guys noticed this, but I think it's sort of, one is really cool, and two, the author uses a lot of great onomatopoeia. So instead of just like the typical, you know, boom, bang, pow that we hear, it sort of like pairs them with actions, and also sort of like signifies or shows things happening. But so you sort of like hear the helicopter before they even describe it. That makes sense. Anybody have any questions about any of these? Great. Good job on that. So since this is the last lesson, I want to thank you guys for taking this course. And the last thing I'll ask you guys to do is to fill out this feedback form for me. So it's sort of like the midpoint one, except obviously that this one goes for the whole course. What else? I noticed some of you guys have submitted homework sometime today, which is great. I will get to them in the next day or two. And if you haven't finished the homework, feel free to submit that. I believe the portal will remain open for you to submit. So if you submit them, I'll get notified and I will grade them and return them to you. Send me a message in the chat when you are done with the feedback form. Just a reminder to send me a message in the chat when you're done so I know.